support for and my solidarity with my fellow educators out there, EMS educators, faculty, program directors. We're now approaching 2 years into this pandemic, and I don't know about you, but complete exhaustion has set in, along with dealing with added pressures of pressures to fill a classroom with your new students and adding a new cohort to continue this workforce pipeline shortage at the time of very limited resources to do so. So it may be hard to think about conducting research on top of all of your current teaching and administrative responsibilities, but much less attending graduate school. But it's also a really incredibly important time for us to take the reins in leading the research that's going to drive our industry forward. So I just want to throw that out there. I appreciate that research, it always seems sort of like an ancillary thing. I think becoming educator researchers is the real goal. Now I can't advance. Hang on one second. There we go. So almost to the day, this time last year, NAEMSE offered a webinar, and a group of us that you see here, Dave Page, Drs. Kim McKenna, Gordy Cox, Heather Davis, we came together and we discussed the challenges and the opportunities that are associated with going to graduate school, either a master's or a doctorate program, and really with an emphasis on EMS education research. And so we discussed the whys, the what type of research, what type of degree, whether you're going to how to get in, to a program, the cost, the expense, and time and money and personal relationships. And we applied each of our unique experiences to the session. We also did this same session live at NAEMSE the year before. And the overall goal here, and continuing this, so this is sort of a follow-up to that, is that we really would like to encourage more EMS professionals to take that leap and go from curiosity to publication. Ultimately, we'd like to come together in a band of educator researchers, and we can collectively determine the future directions of EMS, the EMS profession, through evidence-based education research that will then translate into safe and high quality clinical practice and positive patient outcomes and community health outcomes. So lofty goals here, but that was really our goal coming forward and starting the whole discussion. And we want to continue that. And today's discussion is a little bit more about the research question itself, or the topic area that you might consider. So if you attended these sessions, or if you've gone to, anything with in grad school, maybe we left you like this. The challenges of graduate school are very real. The challenges of research are very real. And one of the major challenges we discussed is identifying a topic area and honing in on a research question. So that's the point of this webinar. So to address this one challenge, I come bearing gifts. That is, great ideas for topics for thesis. So as it turns out, we planned this webinar and put this date and the topic on the calendar about 6 months ago. And over the past few months, even weeks, some of the most significant work has been published that provides opportunities and that provide fertile soil for the EMS graduate student who might be looking for a topic from which to develop a specific research question. So it's just a really great time to be at this point. And again, it doesn't have to be graduate school. Maybe you're thinking about just doing some research as an educator. This is a great time because we have some direction and support and recommendations. So typically, when you're going to, and some of you might be in graduate school, typically you want to develop a research question, you start with your interest area first, and then you kind of hone in on some topics of study, and then you consider what are some things that are researchable, that you can actually measure and that are feasible for you to study. And then you take to the literature and to see what's been done already, and maybe find some gaps in the literature that interest you and could benefit your students and your programs and your industry. But this is what you're usually confronted with. Certainly feels like it. So much research, so little time. Honing in on a topic, much less a research question, can be a very daunting task. And I'm in no way going to be able to hit every hot button item. So I want you to be able to put in the chat and type in the Q&A if you have elaborations, if you have resources in particular, put them in the chat. Links to you know, other things that I'm not going to mention here that relate to recommendations for research or support for certain topics in research. Again, it turns out in the past year and even really in the past few weeks, we've been presented with really new opportunities for research that are going to impact the future of EMS education. So I'm just going to focus on those opportunities. We have educator, researchers, and EMS leaders probably in the audience here. So please join in the chat. And then if you have a more elaborate contribution, we can take it into the Q&A and get a little deeper discussion on it. So the objectives then of this session are to discuss first the priorities in EMS education research. And I think that's a good place to start because it will have the most impact on the industry if you carry forward these topics. Then explore those topics that are in EMS education research that might be relevant to your practice. So I'm hoping, again, by the end of the session, you'll be able to do that. Explore those areas relevant to your interest area, your own curiosity, and that's relevant to your current practice as an EMS educator. And then finally, I want to provide some important resources that are out there. And this is an area where others can help as well. Resources that can help the EMS graduate student or someone who wants to just conduct research to begin that journey and to help them develop that roadmap that can go from idea to research protocol and then eventually to publication. So what sources am I using to pick the topics? I thought that it would be important that you know my biases. So I'm one of the panelists on the Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Education Research Journal Club webinar that occurs on the fourth Friday of every month. And so over time, we've collected a group, a bunch of current research. And inside those webinars, we've discussed some of the patterns, some of the opportunities for future research. That's one of the main sources that I used. I didn't get a chance to go to any in-person conferences. I attended a couple of virtual conferences, but all of you out there, some of you out there, I text, and call and email, and we get together and talk about what kind of cool things are happening at conferences, what kind of research or calls for research are happening. And so these are some of the main conferences. There was, this wasn't the title, the International Conference-a-thon was a 24-hour international research conference on EMS. And the international world is sort of exploding right now too. The other thing is there are a group of position statements and then now the compendium that came out from the EMS Physicians, National Association of EMS Physicians, that informed my sources here. So then from these sources, I wanted to focus on those that have the potential for the highest impact on our profession as EMS educators, and the impact on the outcome of our students. So this will include topics that align with the future directions of EMS, taking into account things like the EMS Agenda 2050, the release of the 2021 EMS education standards, the National Registry's ALS redesign plans that are going on, the changes to the student minimum competency matrix with the COA EMSP and accreditation of programs, all of these things, and really even importantly, the recent position of the NAEMSP on the education of EMS professionals. That's one of the position statements I think that's really important as well. So I also include education research, though, from the higher education literature, which has just a wealth of research, especially in areas that are relevant to our practice, like STEM research or STEM education research, because these sometimes form the gatekeeper courses to get into healthcare careers. And then promising practices in teaching and learning that optimize equitable outcomes for diverse learners. And then finally, some methodological studies that examine new ways to research old questions. So there's one in particular, I think that's pretty cool, a new way of studying something that can be applied to some of our old research questions. All right, so let's jump in here. we are all experiencing the impact of the pandemic on our programs. And we know that's all we keep hearing, COVID, COVID, COVID. And there's been a flurry of research published on the impact on programs, on education in general. But if COVID did anything, it highlighted major weaknesses that we have and that we've always had in our EMS educational infrastructure. So when we have education programs that are shutting down entirely in the setting of a major public health crisis at a time of a shortage of EMS workers, there's some public health and policy issues to address to avoid this in the future. I'm sure you will agree. So if you're seeking research topics in EMS education research, public health, public policy, you need to read this article. If you haven't done so already, we actually had a research webinar, the PCRF research webinar in September, where we had the authors on and discussed this. You can listen to it on YouTube if you really want to hear right from the authors. You'll recognize a few from NAEMSE here. Dr. Leggio and Dr. McKenna are both authors on this. This is a really important piece of research that launches a whole flurry of research questions out there. So this is just fertile ground. And I want to actually mention one other really quickly. I'm sure people receive these emails. If you wait a bit, you'll have a similar list of priorities that's on an international level. So this study that I'm showing here, the impact of COVID-19 on education, was called Emergency Medical Services Education Research Priorities during COVID-19, a modified Delphi study. And this was published in an open access journal. You can see the reference here, JSEP Open in August of 2021. Highly recommend that you pull this. And I'm going to show a couple of tables from here just to show you the research questions that can come out of here. So again, if you wait a bit, there's going to be another one on an international level, because we're all getting recruitment emails about an ongoing similar study designed to look at education research priorities on an international scale, which I think will be very interesting. But let me take you through a few ideas that stand out from this study. So let me just go through a basic overview if you hadn't read this. There is a task force that's looking at the impact of COVID-19 on the EMS workforce pipeline. And this group specifically looked at, this subgroup specifically looked at the impact on EMS education programs. And this is a group of 15 stakeholder representatives that represent major EMS organizations, all the big ones, NAEMSE, NAEMT, the Ambulance Association. The list is, you can see it in the article. And they developed a list of research priorities, and it was through this iterative several step process of identifying the priorities, scoring them in terms of their importance, and then the feasibility of doing the research to actually ask the questions, and then ranked these finally in terms of priority. So I put up this busy table here, table 2, even though it doesn't have a final ranking. The next ones will have this kind of, taking it down to the final ranking, because this is probably one of the most important tables I've seen in research, education research priorities, at least in recent time. And if you take a look at it, what you see on the left side is the research priority. The ranking that's done here is just by something called a weighted importance score, and they calculated the importance of the research of the item, or the assigned importance by the different stakeholders, and it also that factored in the feasibility score, but weighted it more toward the importance score, because not everybody's a researcher, so they may not be as informed about whether or not something is feasible. But it's still a really important thing to look at, because this will tell you what some of the major stakeholders are saying is critically important to research right now, and in short term. We need to get on this right now, and then whether or not they feel like it's really feasible to look at it. So that can be an area where we can inform practice, not just education practice, but research practice. So if you look at this table, and just glancing down it, you can see the importance scores. The higher the number, of course, the more important it is. Not the weighted importance score is the one that it's ranked, it's organized by, but slide down the mean importance score. You see some numbers that are ranked a little higher, but they hover around the middle. Because the feasibility and the feeling was that the feasibility of doing this kind of study is not, it's not as feasible as it would be, one of the other items that are on the scale. In general, the feasibility scores are, fairly low. But if you look across right around the middle, you see things like, substitution of simulation for clinical and field contacts as, weighted as very important, but maybe not as feasible. So this is, these items in here are going to turn out to be very important. I mean, why should we care about this? Well, because these are the leaders who will support and possibly fund research based upon these priorities. So also, I think Dr. Leggio mentioned as well in our webinar before that, when someone is reviewing, if you're on a review team for abstracts coming into a research presentation or papers coming into a publication, this is a resource to say, this is how important it is. Our national leaders have said, this is an extremely important thing that we need to evaluate. So I would just take a look at this this table 2 and put it aside, and then let's look at some of the top priorities. Let's hone in on some of the top priorities, and then we can see which kinds of research can come out of this. So the final ranking of the top 8 research priorities, and then from that there were 4, I believe, that came out at the top. There was some similarity in the wording. So you can see that, maybe some topic areas can be grouped, but field internship access, of course, during the time of COVID was important. The impact of the lack of field and clinical experience. And that's the impact of it. So what exactly occurs, the student outcomes, the workforce outcomes, that's a translational science, right? What happens in the education setting and the impact on the clinical practice, and then the impact perhaps on the patient outcomes. And then student health and safety was a priority as well. EMS education program availability and accessibility was a top priority. And this, when you look at the definitions, and again, this article has definitions in the back of it, really relates to the sudden move to remote education and some equity issues, educational equity and access for all students in times of this challenge. And then, like I said, simulation to clinical ratio got a low feasibility score, so it didn't bubble up into this group, but it had a very high importance score in the list of items. So you can see that this whole paper provides topics, questions, and another thing that it also provides is a detailed methodology. This is an extremely well-written methodology section, so much so that you could lift this out and you could apply it in another setting. So if you were interested in maybe in your local system in finding out what are, or your region, what are the priorities of all of the industry advisors, and we all have advisory committees, because if you get any federal funding, it's not just about accreditation and accredited programs, but it's also about if you receive Perkins funding, that's you're required to have an industry advisory committee every year at least. And so we have industry advisories. What would be the priorities list that they would produce in terms of education research? So this actually turns out to be an important piece, I'd say, for a number of reasons. Again, if you want to dip your toe into research, or you want to take a look at you're getting stuck on research questions, this is a great place to look, because again, it's a priority list. So the first area that comes out of this, I think, just diving into some topics and ideas that come out of this, and then out of a few other things that I had mentioned before, some of the other sources. So public health and policy research is right up front in the top 2 of those priorities. So addressing a data gap, apparently there is a great gap in data when it comes to evaluating EMS programs. And, as a program director of a paramedic program, I know, we collect volumes of data as part of our, program review process, as a part of accreditation, internal processes in the college, but that may not occur at every level. And in particular, the majority of EMS education will happen at the basic level, at the EMT level. And also, what about continuing education as well, and maintaining accreditation, or I'm sorry, maintaining certification. So there's limited data from EMS programs to make studying important factors like what should be the typical number of patient contacts when you don't even really know anything about the programs. That actually became very much highlighted during the COVID-19 pandemic. So if you're a public health or public policy research person, or you're going to graduate school for public health or public policy, these issues of addressing data gaps through public policy and educational infrastructure issues, access to, to all of the resources that a program needs in order to complete. The shutdown of the healthcare programs and the impact on the workforce pipeline is a major issue, that public health issue and policy issue that needs to be handled across healthcare. And we see some research out there in other industries, but specifically, what is the impact, so that the next time the pandemic or something else occurs where it interferes with the ability to place students into a clinical setting, what are we going to do? We need to have things that are in place that actually are evidence-based. And so I think that's one of the things that really comes out of this is what impact has the loss of direct patient care experience had on preparing the EMS workforce? And is simulation a viable option to consider in programs? That sort of comes up as the next one. What is the future of bedside teaching in general? And what defines the quality of experiential education? So all of these are major topic areas, and you can pick subtopics within each. So let's dive in to another area, which is, simulation research. You could do, volumes on this. You can do an entire conference on this, which I think IMSH just had at their conference. And I believe Katie O'Connor was there. I don't know if she's out here in the audience, but I called her and said, what's going on at the, or I emailed her, what's going on at the simulation conference there? And COVID, lots of COVID research, and what are we going to do about different types of simulation? How do we maintain quality simulation, that kind of thing? But really, some of the main questions that come out of simulation research that are relevant to our practice, and this is not just coming from this list of priorities. This comes out of the changes, the things that we need to know about our profession. We need to know what is the ratio of clinical to simulation for certain procedural skills, for certain patient contacts. What about for team leads? And what outcome measures are important to use in order to get at this question? So we have policies inside of our programs, and they may be based on a little bit of information, or maybe they're based on some pretty good information, but we need to actually bring that out to the profession, like nursing has done to a degree. They've supported the ratio of 2 to 1. That actually a lot of nursing programs and states haven't gone to that ratio, but for that, simulation could replace the clinical contacts or clinical hours. And that's another question, hours versus contacts, for up to 50% of the clinical time. So some states have just decided to adopt 25% and keep 75% in the bedside setting. And there's so much behind this that I think in EMS we really need to get at this, and that can actually help us again adjust with the next time something happens and we need to actually adjust to a simulation versus clinical patient contacts. Also, what is the value of some of the contacts as well? And that's been the question, I think, in many of that undergirds many of the research projects in nursing is what is the productivity, the value that's being gained, the value added to a bedside environment versus a simulation environment for certain types of experiences, procedures, skills, in particular those that are not as frequent or those that where you're not going to get the actual experience. So for us, that might be, you know, a neonatal resuscitation. It's highly unlikely in a clinical setting that you're going to get a neonatal resuscitation. So is there, you know, value in observing a real neonatal resuscitation, you know, being the fly on the wall in the at the delivery suite, and then enhancing the practice with high fidelity simulation? And so that's a research question that you can address.
Megan,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
We have our first question, and
I'm sure I knew this one would generate it.
So, do you see there being more online EMT and paramedic classes? That was from Lee Whitlier.
Oh, that's a great question. So distance education is, we're at kind of a critical point. There's federal regulation that was released last year. I think it was last April, distance learning and innovation, that clarifies and specifies what effective and substantive contact is when something is online. I don't think necessarily you'll see 100% online programs. And I think that's something, though, that is a policy question that has to be answered before there is a leap in that direction. Most states have you know, clarifying rules and regulations around the distance education. So, you know, I don't know. That's a really good question. And if somebody else has answers to that, or is more, you know, educated on that, please join in the chat on that one. I think one of the things that comes out of COVID is if you are out there and you're an approved distance education instructor before COVID-19 and before they moved to emergency remote instruction, you knew that when we were moving to remote instruction, this is not distance learning. This is not online education. It's emergency remote instruction. And the minute you go through and learn how to be an online instructor, there are, you know, things that you go through, making this accessible, making your site accessible to somebody who may not be able to interact live. What it was everyone going to Zoom to replace their lectures. That's not actually distance learning. Regular and substantive contact can happen asynchronously and be still effective. So there's that too. So, but I think because of the nature of the field and because of the industry, and I think the industry advisors would weigh in on that and say they needed some kind of a physical, you know, whether it's a 1 week residency or 2 week residency to do all of their simulated contacts or simulated skills. I think that's, we're not likely to see something that's 100% distance, but I may be misspeaking there if anybody wanted to join in the chat.
And then I have one more question here, and it looks like we have Patricia Britt and Dr. Scott Lancaster chimed in. Dean asked, well, he said, in our area, we have tried remote courses with little success. And then he said, is there a possibility of a webinar to help with conducting that style of class? And it looks like there's a good discussion going in there.
Yeah, that's a really good one. And actually, that would be a great webinar. And I believe we have them with Rob Terrio comes on and does some, you know, active learning strategies for distance learning and technology in the classroom that can be used in virtual environments. Because I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. That's a horrible saying, I'm sorry, but that it's, you know, when during this time, we're actually getting some technologies that actually can be useful. So on the one hand, showing up to wait in the hallway while, you know, there's skills checklists being used to check individual students off who are narrating a skill, how effective is that compared to being in an online classroom with a small group and a lab instructor who is running a virtual simulation and testing clinical reasoning skills? So it may be a different thing that you're testing. You're not testing, manipulative skills, but you're getting clinical reasoning. The other thing we see with manipulative skills, and we see this in medical schools, is videotape. So the students will have to practice and then demonstrate a patient assessment on someone who's complaining of chest pain, or, and they'll have to record. And a lot of them have to do that even before COVID, before the online learning. They had to do it, in the classroom as recordings, posting recordings. So I think there are great pearls to be had here. So I don't think it's one or the other. I think it just has to be effective teaching in whatever environment. And the student outcomes have to be the same. And that gets to your workforce feedback. What are they saying about the people who are coming to them in terms of their ability to function in the environment?
We do have one more question here.
Yeah.
As a corollary, what does the data show with regard to graduation rates from online programs already in operation?
Oh, I don't know the outcome data from that. I know some other more, I wouldn't call it flipped classroom, is not an online model. It's not even a hybrid. That's a different model or different modality of teaching. But and that shows promising practices and increased graduation rates and retention and persistence. But I don't know about the online. That's a really good question. Accessibility is a very big deal when it comes to online. So on the one hand, if you're in a rural setting and your students would have to drive 100 miles to your setting, some degree of distance is beneficial, or can be, again, as long as it's high quality. But if you're, just in general saying that, a broad sweeping, we can just move this online and I can stay home in my pajamas, that's I think what people are afraid of. Let's call it what it is. That's what everyone's afraid of, is that it's going to be kind of lazy teaching. So, and I think it's an important question to get at, especially when it comes to the feedback from the industry. So a few other questions, because I know simulation research is a huge topic, but some other little, pearls of ideas. And those of you who are listening, who are looking for ideas, listen to some of the questions that people are asking too. What are the graduation rates? You can get that information. And that's another thing I want to mention, is some people are not always familiar with some of the sources for data. And then we talked about earlier, there is a problem with sources for data as well. What are resources that are needed in EMS education programs to run effective simulations? And by resources, I also need training, because simulations that we currently run, in EMS education programs, well, what kind of practices are people using? We sit around and talk about it. And we say, oh, people make stuff up and they, run things, but we don't know that really. It would be, we know a little bit about it from some of the studies that have been out there. The super study evaluated what resources that programs have, and that was a great eye opener. High fidelity mannequins, meaning very techie mannequins in boxes. But I think we need just sort of basic resources, and you're about to see some of them coming out pretty soon. Some resources that to help educate the educators and to help provide some support for people running simulation. One of the things that I just mentioned is a hot button item. The word fidelity is not equivalent to technology. It's a teaching method, or it's a pedagogy. Fidelity is creating the level of reality. So if the higher the fidelity, the closer to reality you've created. So you can create a realistic scene and not have an expensive mannequin at all. So that's one of the things, just getting away from the idea that you have to have, it's going to be very expensive to run. Now, it might be in terms of resources, in terms of faculty, but we really don't know that. We don't have good models out there of student to instructor ratios, of debriefing times, of the structured simulation. How are people structuring their simulations? Are they providing a pre-brief? a simulation, a debrief? Do they have, ancillary skills stations to actually practice something, in preparation? Do they have pre-work before they go into a simulation? Are they used for formative development and teaching, or are they only used for summative evaluation? And are they sequenced in a way where there's cognitive load issues that are that are handled as we go? And that actually comes up later here. There's a few more questions I've posed here. So the application of current evidence-based practices in medical education from the literature, from not just nursing, but medical education. So there's a lot of really great stuff on simulations. And emergency medicine and the workflow of the resident and the emergency medicine pathway is very similar to EMS. So in terms of how you approach a patient. And so that application of those evidence-based practices, I think, are going to be really important. And then, I mentioned sequencing. So cognitive load of learners as they go through a program is, and I would argue that a person can start a program doing simulation. Everyone has CPR going into an EMT program, which means you've gone up to a mannequin and said, hey, are you okay? And gone through an entire sequence in a mini simulation. So that type, I believe that those things are maybe lower cognitive load. They have maybe some basic learning outcomes that are associated with it. And then you can increase in difficulty. So defining that through some good educational research would be phenomenal. This is a sort of instructional design research. So that's a great ripe area. All of these are just really, questions waiting to be answered, research waiting to be done, even within just our own programs. Again, with all of our extra time. So I do understand that. The last question here dovetails onto the equity issue, which I think is the next major issue. Does cultural humility in simulation? So how are we measuring affective behavior, professionalism behavior, also the design of the simulation itself? Does cultural humility in simulation-based education, will it ultimately translate into reducing disparities in pre-hospital care? We've already seen some of the research about disparities in pre-hospital care. Now we're looking at, and we see some translational science in the medical literature about, and in nursing, and infusing these aspects in simulation and translating that into clinical practice. So it may be that we can address this through the very beginning, through education. And that leads to a next big category, big topic area for research, and that's equity and diversity. So the IDEA task force is out there, the inclusivity and diversity, equity, and access, I think. And there are, priorities that come out of the IDEA task force as well. So pay attention there if you're interested in evaluating and examining issues of equity and diversity. So our EMS student population, are we providing access and opportunity for everyone who wants to be in EMS and practicing as an EMS provider? And are we encouraging a diverse population of people to become EMS providers who will then treat a very diverse population of patients? So examining disaggregated student outcomes data is a very common thing done in higher education. So the higher education literature is full of examining disaggregated student outcomes, meaning disaggregated by the different factors that are measured as people apply for school, whether they're first-generation college student, their primary language of origin, their maybe level of English in some colleges that teach English as a second language, the socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, gender, all of the different factors that can be evaluated in disaggregated student outcomes. And you can actually get this data. If you're at a college, you can get this from your Office of Research. You can some of us can access it directly in a database if we know how to use it. There's some really cool studies in STEM courses that demonstrated, we looked at one, I think last summer, a researcher came on and discussed this 5-semester or 5-year study. I think it was 5 summer semesters, using an accelerated organic chemistry course and comparing active learning strategies in flipped classroom versus the traditional method of teaching. And they were side by side every summer. And so they, ran it for several years. And the two groups they looked at were called the repeaters and the non-repeaters. So they always had, organic chemistry is a huge gatekeeper to medical school, to STEM careers. So they looked at the repeaters versus the non-repeaters and their outcomes, their grades and their pass and no pass. And that was a very cool study. And they was one of the most obvious, like, visual displays of reducing the achievement gap to what used to be called the achievement gap to zero between repeaters and non-repeaters. Repeaters are people who had to repeat organic chemistry. They had a very low success rate and low scores. And the difference in the scores between the two classes, the two types of teaching, and both classes, by the way, had equal amounts of repeaters and non-repeaters in them. And the outcomes of the non-repeaters were so much higher in the active learning strategy flipped classroom model. So that was just a tremendous, boost for flipped classroom model, and in a STEM course, in an accelerated organic chemistry course. There's really good stuff out there that you could take and look at and review and replicate in a smaller degree or to the same degree. So that was a single class, so that actually could be done again. The other thing is teaching practices. So growth mindset versus fixed mindset among educators. That's another really a hot topic. Do growth mindset methods actually measuring whether or not there are attitudes in your faculty or in the students about having a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. And of course, that's based on Carol Dweck's research about having a growth mindset being more meaning that you feel that you can continue to learn, your brain is plastic and you continue to learn, versus a fixed mindset, oh, I'm not good at math or whatever. And looking at those attitudes and the outcomes of students, the resilience, the persistence, the retention, even coming to the table at all, looking at those types of outcomes, I think those are promising areas in research and important ones as well that relate to, are we really providing the opportunity for everyone to come to the table? And then the other thing would be institutional policies. Again, getting back to kind of policy, do institutional policies, or, again, like I mentioned, instructor bias, do they negatively impact student outcomes? So are there policies related to things like entrance testing into your program, recruitment, and just things that looking at those kinds of things and removing barriers to enrollment can be influential in creating an inclusive environment. And we know that from the education literature. Now, how about applying it to the EMS classrooms and seeing if if it has relevance, if we see any movement there, and again, providing opportunity for all. Another area of, along with that, we had, I mentioned bias, that somebody had published we talked about a study on implicit bias in EMS. And I think something like that could easily be applied also directly to our classrooms and our student population as well. Okay, so the next segment here, or the next big area, is really in terms of curriculum design. So this was the paper I had mentioned, this position statement, and Dr. Leggio is the primary author on it, so very accessible and reachable. Dr. Maya Dorset also has a very accessible, reachable emergency physician, EMS physician, and they wrote this position statement and resource document that we should educate beyond a technical scope, moving beyond the technical skills and evaluating things like student competency in communication skills, in clinical decision-making, and then integration of social elements of medicine in with the technical and clinical elements of medicine. So this is curriculum design. This is, public health. I mean, there's a number of things in here as well. Emphasis on communication skills, competency, developing a competency framework, I think is really important here. And then, how are we going to take the new education standards, which do call for teaching the social determinants of health, and then evaluate student outcomes related to that. How are we teaching, and then how are we evaluating the students' understanding of the integration of social factors into their assessment, into their treatment plans, into the patient outcomes. Another area I think that's ripe for research, and again, it comes from something, it made me start, I've been thinking about this pedagogy for a while, these types of teaching, these methodologies, deliberate practice and mastery learning. If you go to the Northwestern Medical School site, there's an author, William McGahey, who has a lot of great stuff on this. He's a PhD in education, and he's got a lot of really good stuff on the use of deliberate practice and mastery learning in procedural skills in particular, but also in other skills in medical school and in residency programs. And then the use of simulation-based mastery learning. That, I think, has an incredible application to EMS. So if you want to study a teaching practice, the use of deliberate practice and mastery learning and simulation-based mastery learning, and the association with things like retention and critical thinking skills and clinical reasoning skills, and and also the student outcomes and the measurement from the employer end, all the way out. That's wide open. And the reason I bring up the compendium of airway management position statements, I'm not sure if you know about this, but the pre-hospital emergency care has a special edition that has the NAEMSP has produced a compendium of airway management position statements and resource documents. One of those articles or position statements is on airway education. And it made me immediately think, and as I was reading it, it's even right in there, the use of deliberate practice, and I don't think they use mastery learning, but I think they use deliberate practice for bag mask ventilation is essential. So I think looking at, how do we teach an important skill like bag mask ventilation? Are we using things like deliberate practice? If we do, what kind of outcomes are we seeing in terms of the student's ability to practice and the patient's ability to be ventilated well? So all of these things, I think, are really ripe as well. And we've now been handed this statement from, the National Association of EMS Physicians, and with authors that so if you look at the authors on that education paper, you'll recognize a few names there too. So they're handing us these research topics that are absolutely ripe for study at all levels too, at the EMT level, actually in many ways at the bystander CPR level as well. So we have a lot of research questions out there related to things like this. And deliberate practice and mastery learning, I think, it's time to start looking at it in EMS education. Then there's another topic that I wanted to bring up that's come up in the last year. And actually it's been around for a while, but it really has come up in discussion in the last year, is a research method called natural language processing. So you're probably, anybody who's techie out there, much more familiar with how this works. I only know it from this article. We know we've had, plenty of stroke scale articles, and, you can, hard to imagine that we could have another stroke scale article out there, but the improving pre-hospital stroke diagnosis using language processing of paramedic reports takes a new spin on that question by using a different methodology. So it is using, qualitative data to, instead of using biased, researchers, arguably biased researchers, to code, which is, you try to reduce your biases as much as possible, but we know that when we're doing coding and thematic analysis that we're biased researchers. You use an artificial intelligence machine learning process called natural language processing to evaluate the either narratives, written narratives, or transcripts of audio. That's just ripe for research and education. So this was an article that describes the technique or describes the process of qualitative analysis using natural language processing for the processing of paramedic reports. But think about it for these areas. So simulation, commonly we record simulations. So you may have a video recorded which can get an automated transcript, or you can develop a transcript from the video recorded simulation. You may record debriefings, you may record pre-briefings, and evaluating the language that's used, maybe even by educators during a simulation debriefing, or by the students themselves. That would be a great growth mindset, fixed mindset study, evaluating for deficit language that's used in feedback. How often does the instructor talk versus the student? All of these things can help us, bring to light the things that we need in terms of resources when it comes to designing simulation. Classroom teaching, you can record classroom teaching, audio record and get transcripts, and use natural language processing to listen to your, even as a self-evaluation, I'd love to do this, to listen to, am I using any deficit language that negatively impacts students or students of in different cultures. So I think this is ripe for a number of areas, this natural language processing. And I don't know if people are familiar with other studies that use this. I believe debriefing may have been studied in other areas when it comes to the language that people use, how much they talk, that kind of thing. And then feedback to students. So we provide feedback to students. If you're an online instructor, you provide feedback to students in discussion forums, on assignments. You provide written feedback to students. What about feedback that's in internships and during field internships? That would be, an amazing thing to use. I'm thinking about all the narratives that are written in the student documentation in a paramedic program, all of the writing that's done on internship forms to evaluate for the common features, the common things that are raised during an internship. There's so many different areas, and I think this one research methodology now brings, or it's actually a tool, really. To the methodology is qualitative analysis still, but it allows you to make it more accessible and to evaluate it in different settings, and to remove maybe an element of bias. Now, there's so much more. There's human factors research. There's so many other things out there and actually human factors can be, factored in here as well. There's just so much more. But these were the things that I could come up with in knowing and knowing that we're only going to be here for an hour. The ethics, I wanted to bring up an ethical issue as well. If you are using simulation, there is something, and if you're planning on it, consider a simulation fiction contract. So recording and doing things and using it later for research. A fiction contract is, just like you probably have student contracts that say, I've read the syllabus and I understand the policies. And a fiction contract says, it's between the instructors and the student, that you are going to, simulation is a safe place and safe environment for learning, and that we're going to, do our best the instructors will do their best to make it a realistic situation so that the student can suspend disbelief. It's the student's job to basically engage in the simulation and apply their practice as though this was real. And then as part of that, there's usually a confidentiality statement as well. And I don't see a whole lot of this in EMS programs. And I think that it's a confidentiality statement is important in terms of what happens in simulation stays in simulation, performance issues, debriefings, that kind of thing. And then you might be measuring and using data already that you have, again, from your college, Office of Research, or from things that you've collected in the course of being an accredited program. And then you decide to go back and do publish it. Remember that you still need to do IRB. You may not need a full board or an IRB review, but at least for exemption, at least making sure that they evaluate that you don't need, even if it's for quality improvement or if it's de-identified already, just something to make sure that an ethics board has approved that you can go ahead and publish this. And if you don't have access, that's where it's helpful to contact, one of us, either from the Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Board of Advisors or NAEMSE Research Committee. There's plenty of people who can help you with trying to figure out where you can get it reviewed if you don't have complete access to it. So the last thing I wanted to mention, and I did mention it earliest, is there are opportunities. How do I support myself through this? How can I, I want to launch something, but I need a little support for it. The big plug that I want to make is for the National Registry's EMS Research Fellowship. I mean, look at all of the people. Think about the names that have come out of, and the volume of incredible research that's come out of the EMS Research Fellowship. Dr. Remley Cloro, Dr. Tony Fernandez. I mean, a number of the names that you saw in the earlier research papers. These are all folks that went through the EMS Research Fellowship. And if you go to their research department website, you can find out information. You can also request data or work with them. I think Kim McKenna might have done that for her dissertation research. So I think there's opportunity out there. And this is one where it can actually support you to not only get what you would like to do, which is complete your degree and do some research, it also contributes incredibly important stuff to the literature so we can advance the profession. Another thing that I decided to put up here, because it's not a research fellowship, but and it's really a professional development opportunity in EMS education, but it really is, it brings up research questions, and there's certainly plenty of EMS research that could come out of it. And that's this longitudinal professional development opportunity called the EMS Educators Collaborative that's sponsored by NAEMSP and NAEMSE. And if you go to NAEMSP's website, I know you can read more about it. I'm sure it's on NAEMSE's website as well. I know I saw it really on the NAEMSP's website. But that's an opportunity to actually be part of a collaboration, a collaborative group, and then produce something that's supposed to be presented at the NAEMSE conference in August. So this is another opportunity to help you kind of move your research forward. I think that's all I'm going to probably have time for, right on the dot. And I hope this provided maybe some seeds of thought for people that are thinking about research. There's so many other areas that are important. And I don't know if you have any, do we have any other questions?